Hangar bay echoed with the familiar sounds of pre-flight preparations, hydraulic systems whining to life, the sharp hiss of compressed air, and the rhythmic clang of wrench against metal. But cutting through it all was something else entirely: laughter. Not the good-natured ribbing that usually accompanied squadron life, but something sharper, more cutting, something that made Captain Sarah Eagle 7, Martinez's jaw clench as she ran through her final equipment checks. "Hey, Eagle 7, called out Lieutenant Commander Jake Razor Thompson from across the hangar, his voice dripping with mock enthusiasm. "Make sure you don't fly into any mountains today. Wouldn't want our majestic bird of prey to crash into something she should have seen coming." The group of pilots around him erupted in snickers, some not even bothering to hide their grins behind their flight manuals. Sarah kept her eyes focused on her helmet's hood display calibration, her fingers moving with practiced precision across the touch controls. She'd heard worse, much worse. In the 18 months since she'd been assigned the call sign Eagle 7, it had become less of an identifier and more of a running joke throughout the squadron. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially not on Sarah herself. The thing about Eagles is that they're supposed to have perfect vision. 2020 doesn't even begin to cover it. Eagles can spot a rabbit from 2 miles away, can see ultraviolet light, can track multiple moving targets simultaneously with a visual acuity that puts human eyesight to shame. So when Captain Sarah Martinez had been given the call sign Eagle 7, during her first week at Nellis Air Force Base, everyone assumed it was a tribute to her legendary marksmanship scores from flight school, or perhaps her uncanny ability to spot enemy aircraft on radar before anyone else. They couldn't have been more wrong. The truth was far more mundane and infinitely more embarrassing. Sarah Martinez was legally blind without her corrective lenses, a fact that had somehow slipped through the cracks during her initial physical evaluation, thanks to a combination of bureaucratic oversight and her own carefully concealed accommodations. She wore specially designed contact lenses that corrected her vision to better than 20/20, but the irony of an eagle who couldn't see wasn't lost on her squadron mates once the truth inevitably came out. It had happened during a routine training, exercise 6 months into her deployment. A particularly aggressive maneuver had dislodged one of her contacts, leaving her with severely compromised vision in her left eye. She'd managed to land safely, barely, but not before the incident was logged, investigated, and eventually became squadron legend. From that day forward, Eagle 7 had transformed from a call sign of respect to one of barely concealed mockery. "At least she won't see us laughing at her," had been Razor's contribution to the ongoing commentary, a line that never seemed to lose its comedic value among the other pilots. The worst part wasn't the jokes themselves. Sarah had developed thick skin over her years in the military, and she understood that hazing was as much a part of squadron culture as formation flying. The worst part was how the constant ridicule had begun to affect her performance. Second-guessing became her default mode. Every decision in the cockpit was filtered through the lens of doubt that her squadron mates had so carefully cultivated. When you're constantly reminded that you're the pilot who can't see, it becomes increasingly difficult to trust your own instincts, even when those instincts had been honed through hundreds of hours of flight time and countless successful missions. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the squadron commander, had noticed the shift in Sarah's confidence during recent training exercises. Hayes was old-school Air Force, a veteran of 3 combat deployments who had clawed her way up through the ranks when being a female fighter pilot meant facing obstacles that would have broken lesser individuals. She recognized the signs of a pilot being systematically undermined by her own unit, and she didn't like what she saw. "Martinez," Hayes had called out after yesterday's debriefing, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made even seasoned officers straighten their spines. "My office, 5 minutes." The conversation that followed had been unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. Instead of the expected reprimand for her recent hesitation during combat scenarios, Hayes had been surprisingly direct about what she saw happening within the squadron dynamic. "You know what I see when I look at your flight records, Martinez?" Hayes had asked, settling back in her leather chair with the kind of casual authority that comes from years of command. "I see a pilot with exceptional situational awareness, superior technical skills, and the kind of adaptive problem-solving that most aviators spend their entire careers trying to develop. What I don't see is the pilot who's been showing up to my training exercises for the past 6 months." Sarah had remained silent, unsure of where the conversation was heading, but certain that honesty was her only viable option. "They're getting to you," Hayes continued, and it wasn't a question. The call sign jokes, the constant commentary about your vision, the way they've turned your medical accommodation into some kind of squadron comedy routine. And you're letting them. The words had stung because they were true. Sarah had allowed the mockery to seep into her consciousness, to plant seeds of doubt that had no business taking root in the mind of a combat-ready pilot. She'd started second-guessing her visual assessments, over-relying on instruments that she'd previously used as backup to her own keen observational skills. The irony was that her corrected vision was actually superior to most of her squadron mates, a fact that seemed to get lost in the ongoing narrative about her supposed visual impairment. "Here's what's going to happen," Hayes had continued, leaning forward with the intensity that had made her legendary throughout the Air Force. "Tomorrow's exercise is going to be different, real different, and I have a feeling that Eagle 7 is about to remind everyone why eagles are apex predators." Now, standing in the hangar bay listening to the familiar chorus of jokes and barely concealed derision, Sarah found herself thinking about Hayes's words. The colonel had been cryptic about the details of today's mission, but there had been something in her expression, a kind of anticipatory satisfaction that suggested she knew something the rest of the squadron didn't. "Eagle 7, you're looking particularly focused today," observed Captain Mike Bulldog Peterson, another squadron member who'd never quite crossed the line into outright cruelty but had never stood up to those who did either. "Try not to fly into any clouds. I know they can be hard to see coming." The laughter that followed felt different today, though. There was an undercurrent of unease that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was her imagination, or maybe the constant mockery was finally wearing thin even for those who participated in it. Either way, she noticed that some of the usual participants in the Eagle 7 comedy hour seemed less enthusiastic about their jokes today. As she completed her pre-flight checklist, Sarah allowed herself to think about what had originally drawn her to flying. It hadn't been the desire for speed or the thrill of aerial combat, though she'd certainly learned to appreciate both. It had been the pure distilled challenge of three-dimensional problem-solving at velocities that left no room for error or self-doubt. In the cockpit, there was only the mission, the aircraft, and the pilot's ability to synthesize dozens of simultaneous inputs into split-second decisions that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Her vision had never been a liability in the cockpit. If anything, it had made her more attentive to her instruments, more careful about visual confirmation of targets, more disciplined about cross-referencing multiple information sources before making critical decisions. The accommodations she'd made had turned her into a more thorough pilot, not a more dangerous one. But try explaining that to a squadron that had decided your call sign was good for a laugh. The mission briefing had been unusually sparse on details. "Training exercise," Hayes had announced. "Advanced threat assessment and response protocols. Multiple aircraft, multiple scenarios. Expect the unexpected." What she hadn't mentioned was that today's exercise would involve elements that none of them had encountered in their previous training, scenarios that would test not just their flying skills, but their ability to adapt to completely unforeseen circumstances. As Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit of her F-16, she performed the mental reset ritual that had served her well throughout her career. Whatever was coming, whatever challenges Hayes had planned for today's exercise, she would meet them with the skills and instincts that had gotten her this far. The jokes and the doubt and the constant undermining of her confidence, all of that stayed on the ground. In the air, there was only Eagle 7 and the sky. The engine spun up with its familiar turbine whine, and Sarah felt the first stirrings of what she recognized as anticipation rather than anxiety. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to a training exercise. Something about Hayes's demeanor, about the unusual secrecy surrounding today's mission parameters, suggested that things were about to change dramatically for the squadron. She just had no idea how dramatically. The first sign that today's training exercise was unlike anything they'd experienced before came exactly 14 minutes after takeoff, when Sarah's radar screen lit up with contacts that shouldn't have existed. According to the mission briefing, they were supposed to be running standard intercept patterns against drone targets, predictable, well-mapped scenarios that allowed pilots to practice their engagement protocols without the complexity of human opponents. But the signatures appearing on her HUD were moving with an intelligence and unpredictability that no drone could replicate. "Control, this is Eagle 7, Sarah radioed, her voice steady despite the growing confusion in the cockpit. "I'm showing multiple unidentified contacts bearing 270, altitude varying between Angels 15 and 30. These don't match our expected target parameters." The silence that followed stretched just long enough to make Sarah's pulse quicken. In training exercises, communication with ground control was usually immediate, professional, and utterly routine. Radio delays meant problems, and problems during flight operations could escalate from inconvenient to catastrophic in a matter of seconds. "Eagle 7, control," came the eventual response, but the voice wasn't the familiar cadence of their usual training controllers. This voice carried an edge of barely contained tension that made Sarah's instrument scan more thorough, more urgent. "You are cleared to investigate and report. Maintain current heading and altitude. Additional instructions to follow." What Sarah didn't know, what none of the pilots in her squadron knew, was that their training exercise had been co-opted 48 hours ago by a crisis that was unfolding in real time across 3 time zones. A rogue military contractor, operating out of a supposedly defunct facility in Nevada, had been conducting illegal weapons tests using experimental aircraft that violated about a dozen international treaties. Intelligence agencies had been tracking the operation for months, but the situation had accelerated dramatically when satellite reconnaissance detected preparations for what appeared to be a large-scale demonstration of their capabilities. The timing couldn't have been worse. With most of the Air Force's elite squadrons deployed overseas or engaged in other priority missions, the closest available interceptor aircraft happened to be Sarah's squadron, engaged in what everyone believed was routine training. Colonel Hayes had received the classified briefing at 0400 that morning, along with orders that were as clear as they were unprecedented. Maintain the fiction of a training exercise while transitioning her pilots into what could potentially become live combat operations. The legal and operational complexities were staggering. International airspace violations, unauthorized weapons testing, the involvement of former military personnel who knew current protocols and defensive measures. It was the kind of scenario that military planners designed elaborate war games around, except this time it was happening in real airspace with real consequences. "Razor, you getting these contacts too?" Sarah heard Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice over the squadron frequency, and for the first time since she'd known him, he sounded genuinely uncertain. The cockiness that usually characterized his radio communications had been replaced by something approaching professional concern. "Affirmative, Eagle 7, came his response, and Sarah noticed that he'd used her call sign without the usual mocking inflection. "I count at least 6 aircraft, possibly more. They're flying in formation but not responding to standard identification requests." What none of the pilots realized was that they were facing aircraft piloted by individuals who had trained in the Heekan, same systems they were using, who had learned many of the same tactics they had been taught, and who understood Air Force operational procedures with an intimacy that made them far more dangerous than any foreign adversary. These weren't enemy pilots from another country's military. These were former American pilots who had sold their expertise to the highest bidder and were now using that knowledge to conduct operations that directly threatened national security. The radio crackled with a new voice, one that sent a chill down Sarah's spine not because she recognized it, but because she didn't. In military aviation, communication protocols are sacred. Every voice on the radio follows specific patterns, uses predetermined call signs, and operates within a framework of linguistic discipline that leaves no room for ambiguity or confusion. The voice that came through her headset violated all of those conventions. American aircraft, you are interfering with authorized test operations. Discontinue your current heading and return to base immediately. The accent was American, the phraseology was professional, but everything about the transmission screamed wrong to Sarah's trained instincts. Control, Eagle 7, Sarah called immediately. Unidentified aircraft are attempting to direct our operations, requesting immediate clarification of rules of engagement. The pause that followed was longer this time, and when Control finally responded, Sarah heard something in the voice that made her stomach tighten. It was the sound of someone making decisions in real time, someone who was adapting to circumstances that hadn't been covered in any training manual. All Eagle flight aircraft, this is Control. You are authorized to treat unidentified aircraft as hostile. Repeat, you are authorized to treat unidentified aircraft as hostile. Weapons are cleared hot. Engage at your discretion. The words hung in the air for a moment, their implications sinking in across multiple cockpits simultaneously. Training exercises didn't include live weapons authorizations. Training exercises didn't involve treating anyone as hostile. Training exercises certainly didn't end with engage at your discretion unless something had gone very, very wrong. Did Control just authorize weapons hot? Bulldog's voice came across the squadron frequency with a mixture of disbelief and adrenaline that Sarah had never heard from him before. That's what I heard, Razor confirmed, and suddenly his usual bravado was back, but tempered now with the kind of professional focus that emerges when the stakes shift from practice to reality. Eagle Flight, this is Razor. Form up on me. We're going hunting. But as the squadron began to coalesce into combat formation, something extraordinary happened. Sarah's radar began painting a picture that her squadron mates couldn't see, not because their equipment was inferior, but because they weren't looking for the right things in the right places. Her years of compensating for visual challenges had trained her to extract maximum information from her instruments, to see patterns and connections that might escape pilots who relied more heavily on visual confirmation. The aircraft they were facing weren't just flying in formation. They were flying in a specific formation that Sarah recognized from advanced tactical manuals. More importantly, they were using electronic countermeasures that suggested they had access to current American military technology. The radar signatures, the communication frequencies, the way they moved through the airspace, everything pointed to opponents who knew exactly how American pilots would respond to this type of threat. Razor, this is Eagle 7, Sarah transmitted, her voice cutting through the chatter with an authority that surprised even her. I need you to break left and climb. These guys know our standard intercept patterns. They're positioning themselves exactly where they expect us to be. Eagle 7, maintain formation, Razor responded automatically, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. The situation had moved beyond the familiar parameters of squadron hierarchy and into the realm of pure tactical assessment, where the pilot with the best understanding of the threat environment took precedence over rank and seniority. Sarah's radar was telling her a story that her squadron mates couldn't read. The hostile aircraft were using a pincer movement that would be devastatingly effective against pilots following standard Air Force intercept doctrine. But Sarah had never been a pilot who relied exclusively on standard doctrine. Her vision challenges had forced her to develop alternative approaches to spatial reasoning and threat assessment, approaches that suddenly seemed perfectly suited to the unconventional tactics they were facing. All Eagle flight aircraft, break formation now. Sarah transmitted with an urgency that cut through military protocol like a knife through silk. "They're herding us into a kill box. Razor, break left and climb immediately. Bulldog, dive and E. Go defensive. Everyone else, scatter and reacquire." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Sarah thought her squadron mates would follow their ingrained training and maintain formation regardless of her warnings. But something in her voice, perhaps the absolute conviction that comes from seeing a pattern that others have missed, convinced them to follow her tactical assessment instead of their usual procedures. The decision saved their lives. As Eagle flight scattered across the sky, the 6 hostile aircraft executed a maneuver that would have been devastatingly effective against a conventional formation. Missiles launched from positions that had been carefully calculated to maximize damage against pilots following standard protocols. But instead of finding their targets clustered together in predictable positions, the incoming weapons found empty air and confused targeting solutions. Holy hell! Bulldog's voice came across the radio with a mixture of awe and adrenaline. "Eagle 7, how did you know they were going to do that?" Sarah didn't have time to explain that her radar had shown her the subtle positioning adjustments that preceded the attack, or that her years of over-relying on instruments had taught her to read tactical situations differently than pilots who trusted their eyes first and their electronics second. What she had time for was the next phase of the engagement, because the hostile aircraft were already adapting to their failed first strike. "Eagle flight, they're regrouping for another pass," Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the complexity of the tactical situation unfolding around her. "These aren't ordinary pilots. They know our procedures, our equipment, our standard responses. We're going to have to get creative." And for the first time since she'd been assigned the call sign that had become a source of mockery rather than respect, Sarah Martinez felt something that had been missing from her flying for months: absolute confidence in her abilities as a combat pilot. The jokes about her vision, the constant undermining of her self-assurance, the squadron dynamics that had made every flight a test of her worthiness, all of that fell away as she transitioned into the kind of three-dimensional tactical thinking that had originally drawn her to military aviation. She was Eagle 7, and she was exactly where she belonged. What happened next would be analyzed in classified Air Force tactical reviews for years to come, but in the moment, it felt to Sarah like the purest expression of everything she'd trained for throughout her career. The hostile aircraft, she could see now that they were modified F-22s, which explained their sophisticated maneuvering capabilities, had regrouped into a formation that no military academy textbook had ever covered. They were flying in a pattern that exploited the psychological tendencies of American pilots, using their knowledge of Air Force training doctrine to predict and counter every move her squadron would typically make. But Sarah Martinez had never been a typical pilot. "Eagle flight, this is Eagle 7, she transmitted, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to bypass the usual squadron hierarchy entirely. "I need everyone to listen very carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound insane, but it's the only way we survive this." Through her headset, she could hear the sharp intake of breath from multiple pilots. In the hypercharged atmosphere of aerial combat, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, asking pilots to abandon their training and follow an untested tactical assessment was tantamount to professional suicide. But as Sarah studied the enemy formation through her instruments, she realized that conventional tactics weren't just inadequate. They were exactly what these rogue pilots were counting on. "They're not just former military," Sarah continued, her radar painting a picture that grew more complex with each passing second. "Look at their formation discipline, their communication protocols, the way they're using electronic countermeasures. These guys didn't just serve, they helped write the book we're all trained from. They know exactly how we're going to respond to every threat scenario they present." The truth was even more disturbing than Sarah realized. The lead pilot of the rogue squadron was Colonel Marcus Viper Rodriguez, a man who had spent 15 years developing advanced tactical doctrine for the Air Force before his discharge. Following a series of incidents involving unauthorized weapons modifications and increasingly erratic behavior, Rodriguez hadn't just studied American air combat tactics. He had literally authored portions of the training manuals that Sarah and her squadron mates had memorized during their years of flight school. Rodriguez knew that when facing multiple aircraft, American pilots were trained to establish mutual support positions that maximized their collective firepower while minimizing their vulnerability to coordinated attacks. He knew that they would attempt to use their superior numbers to bracket his formation and force a decisive engagement. Most importantly, he knew that they would rely on their technology and their training to carry them through a situation that called for improvisation and tactical creativity. What he didn't know was that Eagle 7 had spent the better part of 2 years learning to see combat situations differently than every other pilot in the Air Force. "Razor, I need you to do something that's going to feel completely wrong," Sarah transmitted, her instruments showing her a tactical solution that existed in the spaces between conventional doctrine. "You're going to break formation and appear to run. Not tactical withdrawal, I mean turn tail and flee like you're panicking." "Eagle 7? What the hell?" Razor's response crackled with indignation and confusion. "Trust me," Sarah interrupted, and something in her voice made him pause. "Bulldog, you're going to do the same thing, but in the opposite direction. Everyone else, you're going to cluster up and look like you're trying to provide cover for the retreat." The silence that followed was filled with the kind of tension that precedes either brilliant tactical innovation or catastrophic military disaster. Sarah was asking her squadron to abandon everything they'd been taught about air-to-air combat and instead perform actions that would appear to any observer, including their enemies, as evidence of complete tactical breakdown and unit cohesion failure. "Eagle 7, came Colonel Hayes's voice suddenly over the command frequency, and Sarah realized that their commander had been monitoring their tactical communications in real time. "Explain your reasoning, quickly." "Ma'am, they're using our own doctrine against us," Sarah replied, her hands steady on her controls despite the complexity of what she was attempting to coordinate. "They expect us to fight like Americans, which means they've already calculated responses to everything we're supposed to do. But if we fight like we're falling apart, if we look like we're making amateur mistakes, they'll adjust their tactics to exploit weaknesses that aren't actually there." It was a strategy that could only have been conceived by a pilot who had spent years adapting to situations where her expected capabilities didn't match her actual ones. Sarah's experience with being underestimated, with having her abilities questioned and mocked, had taught her something that no tactical manual could convey. Sometimes the most effective approach was to appear less capable than you actually were. "You want us to look incompetent so they'll make mistakes," Hayes said, and Sarah could hear the wheels turning in her commander's mind. "Not incompetent, ma'am. Panicked. There's a difference. Incompetent pilots are predictable. Panicked pilots are chaotic, and chaos is something you can't really plan for." The hostile formation was closing now, their approach vector suggesting they were preparing for a coordinated missile engagement that would leverage their superior positioning and numerical advantage. In approximately 90 seconds, they would reach optimal firing position for a strike that would likely eliminate most of Eagle flight before Sarah's squadron could mount an effective counterattack. "All aircraft, you heard Eagle 7. Hayes's voice cut across all frequencies with command authority that brooked no argument. "Execute her plan. Now." What followed was one of the most unorthodox aerial maneuvers in modern Air Force history. Razor and Bulldog peeled away from the formation with the kind of abrupt, uncoordinated movements that suggested panic rather than tactical withdrawal. The remaining aircraft clustered together in a formation that appeared defensive but was actually positioned to maximize their collective sensor coverage while minimizing their radar signatures. To Colonel Rodriguez and his rogue squadron, it looked exactly like what they had expected. American pilots reverting to defensive postures when faced with superior tactics and unexpected opposition. They adjusted their approach accordingly, accelerating their attack timeline to exploit what appeared to be a rapidly deteriorating tactical situation. They couldn't have been more wrong. "Eagle 7, I'm in position," came Razor's voice, and Sarah could hear the adrenaline-fueled focus that replaced his usual cockiness when the stakes were real. "Bulldog, confirm your status," Sarah transmitted. "Ready to party," came the reply, and Sarah allowed herself a tight smile. Her squadron mates might not understand the full scope of what she was attempting, but they were following her tactical assessment with the kind of professional trust that defined elite military units. "On my mark," Sarah announced, watching her instruments as the hostile formation moved into precisely the position she had calculated. 3, 2, mark. The next 30 seconds redefined air-to-air combat tactics for everyone involved. Instead of the coordinated missile strike that Rodriguez's formation had planned, they found themselves facing a three-dimensional puzzle that their tactical training had never addressed. The fleeing aircraft suddenly reversed course and attacked, from directions that shouldn't have been possible. The defensive formation dispersed and reformed with a precision that suggested their previous clustering had been deliberate misdirection rather than protective positioning. Most importantly, they found themselves facing a pilot in Eagle 7 who seemed to anticipate their every move before they made it. Sarah's unique approach to spatial reasoning, developed through years of compensating for visual challenges, allowed her to construct a three-dimensional tactical map that her opponents couldn't match. While they were thinking about the engagement, in terms of standard attack vectors and defensive positions, she was seeing it as a complex geometry problem where success depended on positioning aircraft in locations that created multiple simultaneous advantages. Fox 3, she called out, her missile indicators showing target lock on the lead hostile aircraft. But instead of firing immediately, she held her shot for precisely the amount of time necessary for Razor and Bulldog to achieve optimal positioning for their own attacks. The coordinated strike that followed eliminated 3 of the 6 hostile aircraft in a sequence of explosions that lit up the Nevada sky like deadly fireworks. The remaining 3 aircraft, suddenly faced with tactical circumstances they hadn't anticipated and losses they couldn't immediately explain, began to scatter, in what appeared to be their own version of panicked retreat. "Eagle Flight, maintain pursuit," came Hayes's voice over the command frequency. "Do not let them reach the border." But as Sarah banked to follow the fleeing aircraft, her instruments detected something that made her blood run cold. The 3 remaining hostile aircraft weren't fleeing. They were regrouping for a final attack that would be far more dangerous than anything they had attempted so far. "All aircraft be advised," she transmitted urgently. "This isn't over. They're setting up for something big." What none of them realized was that Colonel Rodriguez had been holding back his most devastating capability for exactly this moment. The experimental aircraft under his command carried weapon systems that violated several international treaties precisely because they were designed to eliminate entire formations of enemy aircraft with a single coordinated strike. He had allowed Sarah's unorthodox tactics to succeed in the first engagement because he needed to understand her capabilities before unleashing weapons that would end the fight permanently. As Sarah watched her radar screen, she realized that Eagle Flight was about to face the most dangerous 60 seconds of their lives, and this time, tactical creativity might not be enough to save them. The first indication that Colonel Rodriguez had been holding back his most lethal capabilities came not through Sarah's radar, but through a subtle shift in the electromagnetic spectrum that her instruments detected like a whisper of approaching doom. Her electronic warfare systems, calibrated to identify known threats, began registering signatures that shouldn't have existed. Weapons platforms that operated on frequencies and power levels that violated every international treaty governing aerial combat. "Eagle Flight, I'm detecting energy buildup from the remaining hostiles," Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the ice-cold realization that they were facing technology that belonged in classified military research facilities, not in the hands of rogue contractors. "Whatever they're planning, it's big enough to light up every sensor I've got." What Sarah couldn't see But what her instruments were frantically trying to tell her was that Rodriguez's remaining aircraft had just activated a coordinated weapons system that represented the darkest edge of military technological development. Each of the 3 aircraft carried experimental directed energy weapons, essentially airborne laser systems capable of precision targeting at ranges that rendered conventional air-to-air missiles obsolete. More devastating still, the 3 aircraft could synchronize their targeting systems to create overlapping fields of fire that would make evasive maneuvering virtually impossible. Colonel Rodriguez had spent 2 years developing these systems. During his final assignment before his discharge, ostensibly as part of a classified Air Force research program into next-generation air superiority weapons. What the Air Force hadn't realized until after his departure was that Rodriguez had been simultaneously developing the technology for private contractors willing to pay exponentially more than any government salary could offer. The weapons, now. Bearing down on Eagle Flight represented military technology that was approximately 5 years ahead of anything the pilots had trained to face. Eagle 7, I'm showing massive power spikes from all 3 remaining hostiles. Razor's voice crackled through the radio with an edge of concern that cut through his usual professional composure. My threat warning system is going insane, but it's not identifying any specific weapon types. That's because these aren't weapon types we've seen before, Sarah replied, her mind racing through the tactical implications of what her instruments were revealing. The energy signatures suggested directed energy weapons, but the power levels were far beyond anything she knew existed in operational form. Worse, the 3 aircraft had positioned themselves in a triangular formation that would allow them to create a crossfire pattern covering virtually every possible escape vector. Through her headset, Sarah could hear the subtle shift in radio chatter that indicated her squadron mates were beginning to grasp the severity of their tactical situation. These were experienced combat pilots who had faced enemy aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, and electronic warfare systems throughout their careers. But the technology they were confronting now operated according to principles that made their training and experience suddenly inadequate. Control, this is Eagle 7, Sarah transmitted on the command frequency. I need immediate clarification on rules of engagement. These aircraft are employing weapon systems that appear to be experimental military technology. Repeat, we are facing experimental military technology. The pause that followed stretched long enough for Sarah to complete another full instrument. Scan. And when Colonel Hayes's voice finally came through her headset, it carried a weight of authority and concern that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Eagle 7, you are cleared for any and all defensive measures necessary to protect your flight. Repeat, you are cleared for any and all defensive measures. Additional support is en route, but you are not to wait for backup. Engage and neutralize. Immediately. The subtext was unmistakable. Whatever Rodriguez and his rogue squadron were carrying, it represented a threat significant enough that the Air Force was willing to authorize tactics that would normally require explicit Pentagon approval. Sarah found herself facing a tactical scenario that existed in the shadowy intersection between military engagement and national security crisis, where the usual rules of engagement gave way to the brutal mathematics of survival and mission success. But as Sarah studied her instruments, looking for any tactical advantage that might offset their opponent's technological superiority, she realized that Rodriguez had made one critical miscalculation. His experimental weapon systems, for all their devastating capability, operated according to targeting algorithms that assumed his opponents would behave like conventionally trained Air Force pilots. The systems were designed to predict and counter the tactical responses that American pilots learned in flight school and refined through years of standardized training. They were not designed to counter a pilot who had spent 2 years learning to think about aerial combat in, fundamentally, different ways. Eagle Flight, listen very carefully, Sarah transmitted, her voice cutting through the radio chatter with an authority that had become increasingly natural over the past hour. What I'm about to ask you to do is going to feel like suicide, but it's the only way we survive this. Those weapons they're carrying are designed to track and eliminate aircraft flying in predictable patterns. So we're going to fly in patterns that no sane pilot would ever attempt. The formation that Sarah had in mind existed at the intersection of aerospace engineering and controlled insanity. She was proposing to use the F-16's aerodynamic capabilities in ways that pushed the aircraft to the absolute limits of its structural tolerances, creating flight paths that would be impossible for targeting computers to predict because they violated fundamental assumptions about how military aircraft could be maneuvered in combat situations. Eagle 7, specify your tactical plan, came Hayes' voice over the command frequency, and Sarah could hear the tension of a commander who was asking pilots to risk their lives based on tactical theories that had never been tested in live combat. Ma'am, we're going to use the fact that their targeting systems expect us to fly like Air Force pilots, Sarah explained, her hands already making the subtle control adjustments that would position her aircraft for the most dangerous maneuver of her career. But if we fly like test pilots pushing experimental aircraft beyond their design parameters, their computers won't be able to calculate firing solutions fast enough to track us. What Sarah was proposing bordered on aeronautical suicide. She wanted her squadron to intentionally enter flight regimes where the margin between controlled flight and catastrophic structural failure measured in fractions of degrees and split-second timing variations. They would be flying their aircraft at stress levels that could result in wing separation, engine failure, or complete loss of control, but they would be doing so in patterns that no targeting computer had ever been programmed to anticipate. You want us to break our own aircraft to confuse their weapon systems. Bulldog's voice came across the radio with a mixture of awe and terror that perfectly captured the audacious nature of what Sarah was suggesting. Not break them, Sarah corrected. Use them the way they were designed to be used by people who understand that sometimes the difference between success and failure is your willingness to push beyond what's supposed to be possible. The 3 hostile aircraft were moving into final attack position now, their exotic weapon systems charging to full power with energy signatures that made Sarah's threat warning systems emit continuous alarms. In approximately 30 seconds, Rodriguez would have optimal firing solutions on all 6 remaining Eagle flight aircraft, and the engagement would end with a coordinated strike that no conventional evasive maneuver could avoid. All aircraft, execute on my mark, Sarah announced, her flight controls positioned for a maneuver that would either save her squadron or destroy it in a spectacular demonstration of the limits of human engineering. 3, 2, mark. What followed redefined the boundaries of what military aviation experts believed was possible with conventional fighter aircraft. Eagle flight didn't just evade the incoming directed energy weapons. They turned their F-16s into high-speed, 3-dimensional puzzles that operated according to flight dynamics no targeting computer had ever been programmed to solve. Sarah led the formation through a series of maneuvers that combined elements of aerobatic flying, test pilot methodology, and tactical innovation into something that resembled controlled chaos more than military aviation. Her aircraft pulled G-forces that pushed her to the edge of consciousness while executing flight paths that changed direction and velocity in patterns that appeared random but were actually calculated to maximize the confusion of automated targeting systems. The exotic weapons that should have eliminated Eagle flight in a matter of seconds instead found themselves trying to track targets that violated their fundamental programming assumptions. The targeting computers, designed to predict the flight paths of conventionally maneuvered military aircraft, generated firing solutions that consistently placed their energy beams in locations where Eagle flight had been, rather than where they were going to be. Holy mother of... Razor's voice came across the radio in a mixture of adrenaline and disbelief. Eagle 7, I don't know what you just did, but their weapons can't lock on to us. But Sarah's attention had already shifted to the next phase of her tactical plan. The evasive maneuvers had neutralized Rodriguez's technological advantage, but they hadn't eliminated the threat. The 3 hostile aircraft were still operational, still dangerous, and still capable of adapting their tactics to counter whatever Eagle flight did next. More importantly, Sarah's instruments were telling her that the experimental weapon systems were already beginning to recalibrate, adjusting their targeting algorithms to account for the unconventional flight patterns they had just witnessed. "Eagle, flight, weapons free," Sarah transmitted. "We've got maybe 60 seconds before their systems adapt to our flight patterns. Take them down now." The missile engagement that followed was unlike anything that would be found in any Air Force training manual. Instead of the carefully coordinated, textbook-perfect attacks that military pilots were trained to execute, Eagle Flight launched a series of strikes that combined precision targeting with the kind of tactical improvisation that could only emerge from pilots who had just spent 5 minutes flying their aircraft at the absolute limits of structural possibility. Sarah's missile found its target first, striking Rodriguez's lead aircraft with a precision that sent debris cascading across the Nevada sky like deadly confetti. The explosion was more spectacular than she had expected, suggesting that the experimental weapon systems carried their own volatile components that amplified the destructive effects of conventional warheads. Razor and Bulldog's missiles followed, within seconds, eliminating the remaining 2 hostile aircraft in a sequence of explosions that marked the end of the most unconventional air-to-air engagement in modern military history. The sky, which had been filled with the electronic signatures of exotic weapons and impossible flight maneuvers, suddenly seemed almost peaceful in its return to conventional physics and ordinary atmospheric conditions. "Eagle Flight, this is." "Control," came Colonel Hayes's voice over the radio, and Sarah could hear something that might have been relief mixed with professional satisfaction. "Confirm all hostile aircraft neutralized. Outstanding work, people." But as Sarah leveled her aircraft and began the process of returning to normal flight parameters, she realized that something fundamental had changed during the engagement. The radio chatter from her squadron mates no longer carried the undertones of mockery or doubt that had characterized their communications for the past 18 months. Instead, she heard the kind of professional respect that was reserved for pilots who had proven themselves under the most demanding circumstances possible. "Eagle 7, this is Razor," came Thompson's voice, and the formality in his tone was unlike anything Sarah had heard from him before. "I owe you an apology. Hell, I owe you more than that. You just saved all our lives with flying that I didn't even know was possible." "Seconded," came Bulldog's voice. "Eagle 7, I don't know how you saw what those guys were planning, or how you came up with those maneuvers, but damn, just damn." As Sarah guided her aircraft back toward base, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 18 months ago, Eagle 7 had been a call sign that represented everything she felt insecure about: her visual challenges, her need for accommodation, her difference from the other pilots in her squadron. The mockery and doubt that had accompanied that call sign had nearly destroyed her confidence as a pilot and had made every flight a test of her worthiness rather than an expression of her capabilities. But today, in the span of less than 2 hours, Eagle 7 had become something entirely different. It had become the call sign of a pilot who could see tactical situations that others missed, who could devise solutions to problems that conventional training had never addressed, and who could lead a squadron through the kind of crisis that defined military careers and shaped Air Force legend. "Eagle 7, this is Control," came Hayes's voice on a private channel. "When you land, I need you in my office for a debriefing that's going to involve some very important people from some very classified organizations. What you accomplished today is going to change how we think about air-to-air combat tactics." "Understood, ma'am," Sarah replied, but her attention was already shifting to the broader implications of what had happened. The engagement with Rodriguez's rogue squadron had revealed vulnerabilities in American air defense capabilities that would require immediate attention at the highest levels of military command. More importantly, it had demonstrated that the Air Force's approach to pilot training and tactical doctrine might need fundamental revision to address threats that operated outside conventional parameters. As Eagle Flight approached Nellis Air Force Base, Sarah could see emergency vehicles and personnel positioned along the runway, evidence that today's training exercise had attracted attention from organizations that specialized in situations where military operations intersected with national security crises. She suspected that the debriefings and analysis sessions that would follow their landing would be far more complex and consequential than anything she had experienced in her military career. But for now, in the quiet moments before landing, Sarah allowed herself to appreciate the transformation that had occurred not just in how her squadron mates viewed her capabilities, but in how she viewed herself. The visual challenges that had made her different, the accommodations that had been sources of mockery, the alternative approaches to problem-solving that had seemed like signs of weakness, all of those had become tactical advantages that had saved lives and neutralized threats that conventional approaches couldn't have handled. Eagle 7 was no longer a call sign that represented what Sarah couldn't do. It had become a call sign that represented what she could do better than anyone else in the sky. As her landing gear touched the runway at Nellis, Sarah realized that she was no longer the pilot who had been mocked for her call sign. She was the pilot who had earned it in the most demanding circumstances possible, and who would carry it with pride for the rest of her career. The laughter had stopped. In its place was something far more valuable: the absolute respect of pilots who had seen her capabilities under fire and knew that Eagle 7 represented something extraordinary in the world of military aviation. Command had called, and Eagle 7 had answered. Everything else was just details.